Happy holidays, everybody, and welcome to BeerSmith Podcast number 52. We've got a great show for you today. Stan Hieronymus is on. He's going to be talking about his new book, For the Love of Hops. I got one quick announcement. We did a major server upgrade to BeerSmithRecipes.com, which has now got over 40,000 recipes on it. I think it's the largest recipe site on the internet right now. But I had to do a major server upgrade in order to support the growth of that site. And as a result, we're running specials right now for BeerSmithRecipes.com membership. So if you're interested in expanding your knowledge, expanding your storage for recipes online, being able to share them across your mobile devices, or just share them with others online, you can go to BeerSmithRecipes.com and take advantage of that special. I'd like to wish you all a happy holiday. And now, without further ado, let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Stan Hieronymus. He's the author of Brew Like a Monk, as well as the new book, For the Love of Hops. Stan, really appreciate you coming on the show to talk about your new book.
Well, I'm happy to talk about it. I've been pretty well obsessed by hops for the last couple of years, and it's going to take a while to wean myself off of it.
Well, you got a great book out, and I was just wondering if you could talk for just a minute about the new book.
Well, it's part of the series from Brewers Publications. First book in the series was yeast. The next book will be water, and that's due next fall. And just in the beginning stages is the work on the malt book, and then you'll have 4 in the series. I like to refer to it as the Reinheitsgebot series.
Yeah, I think John Palmer's working on the water book, right?
That's correct.
Well, I think one misconception a lot of people have about hops is that it's just for bitterness in beer, but it turns out hops is used for a lot of things. Can you talk about some of the other things that hops does for beer?
Credit for a very nice, concise list really goes to Dave Ryder at Miller Coors. He's a vice president in charge of brewing there and their hop research. And when he talks about hops, he starts with like this short list, and I just sort of stole it. Everybody knows about the bitterness, and that's what people talk about in hops. There's been a lot more interest recently, which we're going to talk about upcoming, in aroma. Then there's flavor, and flavor is really a combination of aroma and taste. We think of that as what takes place in the mouth, although what's going on in the nose is still very important. What it adds to mouthfeel, not just bitterness, but the polyphenols, and that they give texture to beer. The foam and the lacing, what looks good. That's when you get a beer that's a pale ale in a beer clean glass, you can see exactly how many sips it took you to drink that beer. Then the other thing that's drawn a lot of attention, and it's worth noting that the book from Brewers Publication before the hops book was the IPA book. And a lot of people have heard the stories about how IPAs were shipped to India and hops provided the stability. And that, in simplest terms, they are antimicrobial, so that they will ward off infections. But beyond that, it provides a second layer of flavor stability, because as your beer ages, either whether it's the fermentation quality or the malts oxidize themselves, you begin to get some not so nice flavors. Well, hops can mask those bad flavors. So the flavor stability goes beyond simply the microbial.
Pretty cool. All that stuff in one little hop cone, right?
Yep. And it's most of that is in the lupulin, which is only part of the cone, but you can't forget about the rest of the hop, particularly because of the polyphenols.
Well, let's start with a little bit of the history of hops. How did it come to be used in beer? I mean, for many years we never brewed beer with hops, right?
Hops themselves are probably about 6 million years old. Scientists are pretty sure that they originated in Mongolia. About 1.25 million years ago, give or plus 200,000 years, hops migrated from Mongolia to Western Europe. Another 500,000 years later, they also migrated to North America.
Hmm.
This is important because if you look at wild hops in North America now and wild hops in Europe, you see that they are genetically different. They bring different character to the beer. There are different compounds out of them. So these hops, more recently, within the last 100 years, have been crossbred to give us the modern hop.
So when do we actually start using them in beer, though?
Well, there is no clear answer. But as far as documented, we can look at monastery papers in 822 in Bavaria, or actually, I guess that's in Switzerland, but in Western Europe, about the use of hops in beer. But it's not until about 1150 that we have the first documentation that hops were boiled in beer, which is when you look at that list we talked about at the top. Boiling the hops is very important.
Mm-hmm.
And so really we're not 1,000 years into using hops like we do now.
So Stan, we've been growing hops for I guess millions of years, but hop production's really taken a lot of twists and turns over the last few years, particularly the past century. What does that mean today? What are we seeing? What are some of the trends we're seeing today?
Well, 100 years ago, unfortunately, growers couldn't actually measure alpha acids because they didn't know exactly what they were. But had they, the strongest hops would have been about 6 alpha acids, and many of them were half of that. They were called landrace hops. They were selected based upon how they grew. But about 100 years ago at Y College, you had crossbreeding begin, which was to start so that you had healthier hops for growing, of course, but also higher alpha acids. And to do this, they crossbred hops, wild hops from North America, with European landrace hops, with the idea of retaining the same aroma character. Since then, and this is really within the last 40 years, when Cascade was released, you started to have hops with an American character be considered that you wanted to have those in your beer. In the course of this time, you also had the alpha acids continue to escalate. For industrial brewers who are not interested in aroma, in having much hop character in their beer, they the bittering power. So that's the direction breeding was. That creates hop that is a commodity. And so hop production, hop acreage shrank dramatically because the hops were so much more efficient. At the same time, you had a lowering of the bitterness in beer. Looking at a few numbers, for instance, you go back to 50 years ago, and the average beer in Germany had about 25 IBUs, and they used 1/3 of a pound of hops per hectoliter. Mm-hmm. That worked out to about 8 to 9 grams of alpha per hectoliter. And the world pretty much stood there in the early 1970s. The average alpha used by brewers was about 9 grams. By 1979, that was down to 8 grams. By 1989, it was 7 grams. By 1997, it was 6 grams. And today, it's about 4 grams. It's hard to sustain hop farming. You've got that sort of situation going on. The aroma acreage dropped 49% in the last 20 years. The alpha acreage is down about 5%, but alpha production's up 60%.
So we're obviously producing a lot more high alpha beers, right? Or high alpha hops, right?
Which are used in very small quantities.
Which are used in very small quantities.
and cannot be sold generally at barely a rate that the farmers can make money. But farmers need the range of hops so that they can afford to have the picking equipment, the large kilns, and everything else that goes into hop production. So people who love aroma shouldn't say, "Oh, the large brewers who are buying commodities, they are still subsidizing farmers so they can afford to grow aroma hops."
And of course, it's the large brewers that drive the market, right?
Well, yes and no. To give you an idea, in 2011, American beer production actually shrank 4.5 million barrels. Craft beer was up 1.3 million barrels, which means non-craft beer production shrank almost 6 million barrels. Those brewers probably use comparable to about 2 ounces of hops per barrel. They're not really using any ounces, so from that standpoint, it's a little complicated.
Right.
But let's say that they used about 2 ounces. That means they use about 750,000 pounds less hops. Well, craft brewers use about 1 pound per barrel. So a 1.3 million pound increase in production translates to 1.3 million more pounds of hops. And it's probably more like 1.5, which means overall hop production actually increased, and it's driven by the 6% of the market. In 2011, aroma production was about 30% of acreage in the United States. By the end of this decade, it'll probably be 50%. And
Wow.
That's just a matter of American small brewers using much higher quantities of hops.
So you got a couple things going on here, right? I mean, the commercial brewers, the large commercial brewers have really gone to high alpha acid, hop extracts, lower acreage. But then you got the craft brewing market driving much greater usage of the aroma hops, right?
Yes, and the demand for a wider range of aroma hops.
And that, of course, is good for the homebrew industry because we like to use a wide variety of hops as well, right?
Exactly. And that's the benefits that the homebrewers get is greater choice. And as the smaller brewers learn more about hop farming and hop production, they're putting greater demands on hop quality. And again, homebrewers benefit.
So what opportunities do some of these newer hops provide for the average home brewer?
Well, you're seeing if you look when those first hops were crossbred, which resulted in Brewer's Gold and Bullion, and St. Louis Brewery, which is Schlafly Beers here in St. Louis, is currently doing single hop beers that they put on. They call it Hop Trial. That's the simple name of the beer that you can go in and it just says Hop Trial. You're not quite sure what you're getting. And they brought back a variety of half bales from the Northwest this year. The current Hop Trial is Bullion. Bullion's the sister of Brewer's Gold. These were the first two widely distributed bred hops. And the British brewers at the time described the flavor and aroma as rank, as caddy, black currant. These simply were not acceptable. You go to the Czech Republic now, where they basically, the Saaz hop and some small variations on it, they consider that for lager beers. They don't want that immense fruity character. And they'll say, quite frankly, that when they have a beer with one of those hops, they consider that flavor a flaw. So not until recently did we accept these flavors. Anyway, the Bullion, as I said, it has all this American character in it, and I like the beer, and it's not a new hop variety at all. Part of it is just looking for character that was rejected before, but certainly it allows home brewers to, as we know, everybody wants Citra, or that other fruitiness of the New Zealand hops, and New Zealand hops are almost impossible to get. Maybe we're going to see that more in the Australian hops. So it's more tropical, fruity flavor. Some people, when they try Mosaic, which was harvested at the first time in enough quantity, that I think some of it will be available to home brewers. They get a blueberry note, and we're going to continue to get more unique flavors. I've tasted a few that are experimental stage that have a definite coconut twist to them, for instance.
I know a lot of people have started experimenting with using high alpha hops for aroma too.
Well, that's basically when you look at, for instance, Simcoe. Simcoe was developed as a high alpha hop, and it was selected because it's relatively low in cohumulone. Now, and this was in the 1990s when there was research that indicated cohumulone creates a harsh bitterness. That's since been contradicted, but some brewers continue to want to use those low co-H, which is generally the way people just refer to cohumulone, low co-H hops. But it had this unique aroma, the pininess and quite frankly a certain dank character that appeals to people. And using those late, that's when you get the high oil hops. Magnum, for instance, which is a bittering hop, originated in Germany, but it's grown in both Oregon and Washington. Mm-hmm. Is a key hop in the torpedo mix at Sierra Nevada, and it kicks a lot of oils in. And when those interact with yeast, then you get these unique fruity aromas.
Well, another thing that's changed, I think, is our understanding of bitterness. We used to just talk about bitterness in terms of how long did you boil it, basically. But I think we're starting to determine that bitterness is a lot more complicated than that, right?
Oh, it's bitterness is better understood than aroma, and maybe that's why people would say bitterness was easily understood. It's relatively new, where scientists understood what was creating bitterness, but that we can go in and measure the iso alpha acids. Mm-hmm. And that's the primary contributor to bitterness, and that can give you the illusion that it's easily measured. There's a certain amount of common sense that brewers understand. You add a lot of roasted malt, you're going to get some bitterness. There's the factors that waterness add. Something that's high in calcium sulfate is going to be crisper.
And obviously, as you mentioned, most of it comes from isomerized acids, right? Alpha acids, right?
Right. Well, that's where the actual measured bitterness is iso alpha acids.
So that's the IBUs that most people talk about when they're designing beer, right? You sit down and calculate the number of IBUs you're going to get. It's based on isomerization of those alpha acids, right?
Right. For the most part, it is an effort to look at perceived bitterness, and so understanding when the formula was invented, it was based upon trying to consider how hops aged and how they aged over time. Those, of course, were baled hops, which age quicker, and they were not stored cold as early in the process. But it's a good number for anybody for calculating, because once you figure out what your utilization is, which is the magic number that's almost impossible. But you can make the calculation for the next year. So you can look and say, my Centennial last year was 7.5 alpha acids. This year it's 8.5. How do I make that change for pretty much, if I don't mess around with the rest of my recipe, I can brew consistent beer. The IBU calculation is very useful for that. But you've got to take in consideration the other ways we understand bitterness. For one thing, there are about 25 receptors on your tongue that perceive bitterness. 3 of those specifically to hop bitterness. But genetically, those can vary. What scientists have done is that they actually have taken the ones that perceive hop bitterness and clone them. I think it's in like a cow's stomach or something like that. And they'll go in and dose them and see how they react. And they'll get a sense of this is how the IBU reaction is going. When they turn around and do that in the mouth, it's different because our brain is immediately sensing that bitterness and excreting things through your mucus that mitigate that particular perception of bitterness. The genetic factor in these is gigantic. So if you think that what you're getting perceived bitterness, you can be surprised. It's going to vary from one person to another. Another example would be an experiment at Rock Bottom, where it was using dry hopping and late hopping. So when the hop aroma and flavor was higher, people would say the bitterness was higher in a beer that had the exact same IBU. When people smelled it, that set their perceptions, and then they said it tasted more bitter. Our brains are, there is no formula for them.
I guess that's the point I was trying to get to. Is the IBU number is a great number to use, but it doesn't really tell the whole story. You're really, the perceived bitterness of the beer can vary dramatically depending on other techniques that you use and late hopping, aroma hopping, whirlpool hopping, all these other things.
Right, and those are all going to add to flavor and aroma,
including your grain bill, right?
Yes.
Even the yeast can drive it.
Yeah, well, we can talk about that in terms of how that affects flavor. But one other thing, looking in Germany, that basically what they're seeing, what people can perceive in bitterness, probably stops at about 50 to 60 ISOs per milliliter, what amounts to 60 IBU. Trying to worry about the bitterness factor beyond that is kind of silly.
So the difference between 60 and 150 is probably not much, right?
Yeah, and you can't. Getting above 100 is pretty much impossible in a packaged product.
Right. Well, can you talk for a few minutes about the major hop oils and sort of how they contribute to this overall flavor?
Well, until recently, anything you read about hops would say that the hop oils were about 0.5% to 3% of the hop. Now through breeding, we're getting some 4% hop. So it'd be about 4% of the hop is the major oils. And if you've seen a hop catalog, you'll see there are basically 4 oils listed. That's myrcene, which is going to be the largest factor, and in American hops, up to 60 or 70% of the oils. Caryophyllene, humulene, and farnesene. And to give you an idea, so that just in the raw form, and you'll get these more if you use them just dry hopping. The myrcene is going to be green and herbaceous, and that really gives you the resinous character that you get in late hop and dry hopping. Caryophyllene is going to be more woody, and particularly as it oxidizes, it's a major factor in what people refer to as noble aroma. Mm-hmm. And then humulene is also going to be woody and piney. Farnesene is floral. It barely exists in American hop varieties. It's 20% of the Saaz hop. If anything, the first thing hop readers can look at is the level of farnesene and get a good sense of its background genetically. The key thing is, what happens as these oils oxidize. And at that point, you get, so far identified, more than 400 compounds.
Wow.
And there's a certain amount of debate what the important ones are, because there's an immense amount of synergy. You can put compounds individually will be perceived at incredibly low rates. You put those two together, and it at least jumps up to the point where you can actually measure the perception.
And these oils are fairly fragile too, aren't they? Aren't they volatile?
To give you an example, one that was identified in the 70s is linalool. Linalool will lose, during the course of the boil, probably 70% of the linalool will dissipate. During the course of fermentation, you'll get linalool production. More linalool as the hop ages. And certainly linalool has, which can be orangey and floral, is considered a major component in hoppy flavor. So in the 80s and 90s, there started, and even recently, there was an effort to breed hops so they created more linalool. And Val Peacock, who was a hop scientist at Anheuser-Busch, has since retired, is consulting for the craft industry. Is pointing out to focus on one single oil is pretty silly. And there's pretty much even the Czech Republic, and linalool is an important part of Saaz, would help them sell Saaz hops. Hop scientists will say, let's not just focus on one. It's how they come together. But some of the key ones are linalool. Right now, getting a lot of attention is geraniol, and that's floral and sweet and rosy, and in fact, it's called geraniol because it smells like geraniums, and that's a key difference between American and European hops. American hops have a fair amount of geraniol. Nerol, which is rosy and citrus, citronellol, which is citrusy and fruity, and seems to be something that's adding to the tropical flavor that you get, for instance, in citro, and limonene, which is citric and orange. And to give you an idea about the synergy and what happens when these compounds come in contact with yeast, scientists in Japan did an experiment with citric hops and coriander. Coriander is high in linalool and geraniol. So they made beer with the citra hop and with the coriander. The beers were surprisingly similar. And what happened during production is you got much more citronellol. So rather than looking at how that exists in the raw hop, what you want to know is what happens during the during fermentation, although it's not fermentation. It's what scientists refer to as biotransformation.
Well, as our understanding's grown, as we started to understand a lot of these hop oils, we're seeing a lot more late hop additions. Things like whirlpool hops, aroma hops added at the very end of the boil, or even at flame out, dry hopping. Can you talk for a minute about that?
Well, one of the first efforts is if more brewers are going to the Northwest, and they're rubbing and sniffing these hops. Sometimes they're walking in the fields where there's experimental hops, and if for instance, if you rub and sniff a Tettnanger hop, and what you get in the beer is going to be much different if you're using it during the boil or even with 10 minutes to go, because the biotransformation is so important. So there's one appeal to brewers to rub a hop and say, I really like this. I want to get this character in the beer. You've got a better chance of doing that by making those very late additions. So it's from a cooking standpoint, when you want what you smell in the ingredients in the final beer. And that's part of the appeal of keeping those in. Plus, you realize with the boil, you're losing those compounds. As our understanding of biotransformation goes up, people may be more comfortable with letting their hops boil at least a little bit. But the biotransformations, in fact, can take place during dry hopping.
Well, our understanding of dry hopping has also evolved over the years. I mean, it used to be that we'd throw stuff in there and leave it there for a week, and I don't think many brewers are doing that anymore. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the key thing about dry hopping is what's going on is never happened at scale like this before. Dry hopping took place in a cask. Right. You jammed a handful of hops in a cask. It was in advance when they had plugs because you knew you were putting the same amount in all the time. And now you're somebody like Lagunitas, which is growing at 60,000 barrels a year, more production, and almost everything they do is dry hopped. and they need to find out a way to dry hop on scale, and different breweries are coming up with different solutions. None of which has to be that complicated for home brewers. But in the book, I actually returned to a quote from Peter Buchart from New Belgium, and it's worth noting that New Belgium does, obviously Ranger is a gigantic seller for them, and he suddenly found himself appearing on brewing panels talking about dry hopping, which is something, as he pointed out, he said, if you told him that 5 years before, he just would have laughed right in your face. But what he said, and this is about fermentation of the Belgian beers, is brewing as a compromise. You have to take into account many factors. It's an interaction. You need to see any beer you create as a holistic thing. And you need to do that when you're dry hopping. You can't simply say, okay, the best way is to use cones at 62 degrees and 5/8 of a pound per barrel for 2.5 days. No, you're going to make those compromises starting thinking about what kind of form you're going to use, whether you're going to use cones or pellets, the temperature, and certainly the understanding has gone to dry hopping at much closer to a fermentation temperature. You get faster extraction that way. You get less grassy. You leave it in too long, it's going to get fishy.
Right. I know we used to leave them in a lot longer. Particularly in the early days of home brewing, and I think we're seeing a trend towards much shorter dry hopping times, right?
Right. You can Union Jack from Firestone Walker, Matt believes in basically 3 days is as long as you want your hops on there. So that beer is double dry hopped. It's 3 days, drop the hops out, and then add another dose at three days. There's been some research at Oregon State that you're getting almost all the extraction in the first 12 hours, but that is at a much warmer temperature, and that might be tempting fate. And then there's the question of quantities, and it certainly varies from, but generally it's a half barrel to a half pound to 1.5 pounds per barrel. And that gets a little complicated on the homebrew scale, but to give you an idea, that a pound per barrel is 3.85 grams per liter.
Or how many ounces in, say, a 5-gallon batch? Maybe 2?
19 liters is 5 gallons.
Right.
The thing is, like, I don't know how many people actually hit 5 gallons. I never hit 5 gallons. You know, I'm going to be 5.5, 4.5, things like that. So I'm trying to figure that out. But that would work out for 2.5 ounces if in about 5 gallons.
Right.
By the time you change every calculation, 3.85, it might be 3.83 actually.
Yeah.
And then changing ounces to liters and things like that. And the first thing I'd advocate is that people consider measuring their hops in grams and think about how many liters they're using.
You talk quite a bit in the book about growing, processing, storing hops. We can't go into detail on all those, but I was wondering if you'd give a few tips to homebrewers about how to get fresh hops and then how to maintain that freshness.
Well, the first start would to be aware of that we're basically buying hops at 2 times a year if you want them fresh. You needed to get your hops from Australia and New Zealand last August. That's when they came in the United States. And now's the time to be getting your hops from the northern hemisphere. In other words, from Germany, if you're using those hops, from England, Czech Republic, whatever, and North America. The better idea you have of the chain of custody for those hops, the better off you are. If you can plan your brewing year, get all your hops, then you know they're going to be stored well. They're going to be cold, and this is a great time to get your hops because they aren't going to get warm in transport. So the fewer
storing them well means what?
26 degrees.
Yeah, in a barrier bag, right?
In a barrier bag. Pelletized hops are going to oxidize 3 to 5 times faster than cones, and warm, it's going to become much more. So if you can just haul them out of the freezer in the bags, in other words, if you store them, then just the bag you're going to use, as opposed to constantly opening and closing that bag every time you do that. And then you're warming up the hops to get them out and stuff like that.
Well, you got a great chapter in your new book entitled "The Good, the Bad, and the Skunky." So, can you talk to us a little bit about what can go wrong with hops?
Well, there's that chapter begins by looking at how Sam Adams has changed the way they work with German hops, the middle true hops. And what they've done is they've actually changed the processing in Germany. It used to be that hops would sit in bales on the farm for maybe weeks or even months. And some years it was pretty warm. Now they go cold much quicker. And this is a plus for everybody because it's changed everything in Germany. That's the way all aroma hops are treated now, like you're selling them Sam Adams, because they are the biggest single buyer. And Sam Adams is part of what's known now as the Hop Quality Group, which is about 10 or 12 craft breweries. And they're interacting more with farmers. They're finding out how, what the farmers need, the growing, and things like that. I point to this because when you're talking about what can go wrong, one of the first things that can go wrong is that when hops are shipped in those foils, if they get warm, the foils will expand. They will spoil the hops. When it cools off, the foils will contract. So sitting in the brewery, you can't tell what you got. Then you open it up and you go, oh, this does not smell good. This is not a good idea. So, for instance, if you look at storing at 68 degrees, which a lot of people would take their hops and say, my basement is not that warm, I'll store them down here. Pellets are probably going to lose 10 to 20% of their alpha and twice that of their aroma. Whole hops are going to lose 100%. So if you got whole hops down there at that temperature, you're going to have no alpha at the end of that. As far as something like skunkiness goes, I think everybody understands that's light struck. If you're hyper and I'm hyper, even when you are running off, if you're brewing outside, you want to have your beer in the shade. That it can take just a few minutes to get that skunked part. Another, going back to the importance of oxygen, it's a little trick that Matt Brynildson does, which is to take a bag of Chinook, open it up, and you smell that Chinook, and it's just this perfect piney, what you expect of Chinook. Take that bag and put it in the refrigerator, but leave it open. After only a few hours, you pull it back out and you smell it, and that's when it's American Caddy. And I'm sure everybody knows when we talk about Caddy, we're talking about a cat litter box. That's exactly what it smells like. Is cat urine. This has become maybe at the extreme end something of a desirable aroma. I prefer fruity and piney myself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel bad. We've only just barely scratched the surface on your book. You got so much detail in there, and I do recommend the book. I've spent some time with it now, and it's just an amazing book. But I was wondering if you just had one or two tips to share with us here at the end, Stan, for an average home brewer.
I'd say, first of all, be willing to experiment with these hops. Use one at a time and make changes. Understand the role that yeast is going to play in the bio transformation. I wrote something for Zymergy that'll be in the next few months. It should be in Zymergy that looks more like biotransformation, which is obviously discussed in the book. Right now, there's so much interest in dry hopping, and there's a need to understand the stability issues there. You need to keep your beer cool. Sierra Nevada is at the forefront of almost any research on hops. And what they've seen is that you have got an enormous amount of loss in aroma in the first few days. Then additionally, you get more loss as the beer goes into the headspace and into the liner. So when your beer gets agitated, so if you're brewing and sending your beer to competitions and it's bouncing up and down on a UPS truck, there's every chance your IPA becomes a PA by the time it's judged.
Wow. Well, thank you, Stan. I really appreciate you being on the show. Is there anything else you'd like to add real quick before we go?
Not really.
Well, I'd like to, can I put in another pitch for your book?
That'd be fine. And I tell you what, if we can figure out a way to somehow people send you questions, maybe we can do a show. We'll just go with their questions.
I'd be more than happy to do that. Maybe we set something up here in the spring. So send your questions in, and we'll pile them up. Just send them to, you go to beersmith.com, go to the Contact Us page, and send a question in, and I'll compile them up, and we'll talk to Stan again here in the spring.
About what wasn't clear in the book, and I'm sure there are some things they won't quite understand. I'm not sure I understand them, or what we didn't get to in the book, or even if they haven't read the book. But you want to keep up with your friends, you need to have the book.
Absolutely. Well, again, today my guest was Stan Hieronymus. He's the author of Brew Like a Monk, which we talked about in a previous podcast episode, actually. And his new book is For the Love of Hops. It's from Brewers Publications, and it's available on Amazon, as well as many of your local bookstores. Well, I'd like to thank Stan one more time for appearing on the show. I really appreciate all of your support. I'd like to wish each and every one of you a happy new year, and I hope you have a great brewing week.